The ground around the new injection well site in Grady County, Oklahoma, had been cleared by every seismologist Red Earth Energy ever sent out to look at it. Standard monitoring array, standard detection thresholds, nothing on the instruments worth a second look. Every seismologist except one person whose instruments weren't seismometers at all. Just 2 bare feet on a barn floor and a pair of hands resting flat against a fence post. The way they had been most evenings for 2 months, before anybody from the company ever bothered to ask her what she was feeling. Hattie Lunsford was 16 years old, born deaf, and had been reading that ground the way some people read a face. Long before Red Earth Energy ever leased the 800 acres next door to her family's farm. Lonnie Stratton, who'd ranched the section across the road for going on 40 years, used to watch her stand at that same fence post some evenings, with her hand flat against the wood, perfectly still, sometimes for 10 minutes at a stretch, and said later he didn't think much of it at the time beyond figuring it was just a habit of hers. He understands now what she was actually doing. This is the kind of story my father would have told slow, at his own kitchen table, with all the names left in. If yours did too, this channel is built for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. Grady County, Oklahoma, sits in the middle of ground that's been worked for gas and oil both for the better part of a century. The kind of county where a new lease sign going up at the end of a section road doesn't strike anybody as particularly remarkable anymore. Boyd Lunsford ran 200 acres of wheat and cattle outside Rush Springs, ground his own father had farmed before him, and Hattie was his only daughter. Deaf from birth after a fever nobody in the family had ever fully explained to her satisfaction, fluent in sign and lip-reading both, and as capable around that farm as any hearing kid Boyd had ever worked alongside. Boyd had noticed early, when Hattie was still small, that she seemed to feel a stalling tractor engine through the floorboards before he ever heard the change in it himself. Ground tells you things if you let it, he used to sign to her, dropping articles the way his own spoken English did too when he was tired, the habit carrying over into both languages the same way. He'd spent years afterward quietly teaching her to trust that, to read fence posts and concrete and packed dirt the way other farm kids learned to read a sky before a storm. He taught her to feel a fence post for storm damage before a wind ever picked up. He taught her to feel a water line for a coming leak days before it surfaced. He taught her most of all that the ground rarely lied, even when it took a while to say what it meant. Red Earth Energy leased the 8,000 acres bordering the Lunsford place in late 2023, planning a new gas field development that included a Class II injection well meant to dispose of wastewater pumped up from fracking operations across the wider field. The company's own permit filings valued the project at something north of $140 million, with the injection well itself representing a piece most landowners in the area paid little attention to, the unglamorous back end of an operation everybody mostly noticed for the production wells instead. Boyd still drove the same Ford F-250 he'd bought the year Hattie was born, and still ran a John Deere combine through wheat harvest every June. Equipment that had nothing to do with the gas lease next door, except for the dust the company's survey trucks kicked up onto his own gravel road most weeks that winter. Hattie started feeling something different through the ground sometime in January of 2024. A faint rhythmic pulse coming up through the barn floor and the fence line nearest the leased acreage. Distinct from the ordinary vibration of trucks on the county road or her father's equipment running in the next field. She tested it against the barn floor. She tested it against the fence post. She tested it against the concrete feed pad, 3 different surfaces carrying the same faint rhythm in a way ordinary traffic noise never did. She described it to Boyd in sign, the same patient way she described most things, comparing it to a heartbeat. Except the ground's, not a person's, steady and regular in a way ordinary ground noise never was. She felt it most clearly standing barefoot in the barn or with her hand flat against the northeast fence post, the spot on their property closest to where the company's survey stakes had gone in. Boyd brought it up at a community information meeting Red Earth Energy held in Rush Springs that March, signing for Hattie while she stood beside him, and a few dozen other landowners filled the folding chairs around them. Wanda Pickett, who taught Hattie's third-grade class at the School for the Deaf in Sulphur and still came to most community meetings in the county out of habit more than necessity, sat near the back that night and said afterward she remembered thinking Hattie looked more composed standing up there than half the adults in the room. A company geologist named Marsh Calloway listened politely and explained that the seismic monitoring array installed across the lease showed nothing above the standard detection threshold, that the nearest station was a little over a mile from the Lunsford property, and that respectfully, a teenager's hand against a fence post wasn't the kind of instrument the company's engineers could put much weight behind next to calibrated equipment. He wasn't unkind about it, not exactly. Or maybe a small part of him was, the particular unkindness of a man who'd already decided the conversation wasn't worth the time it was taking before it had even finished. He'd spent 11 years reading instrument data professionally and had no particular reason that evening to think a 16-year-old's hands were telling him something his own array wasn't. What Calloway's array missed, and what an independent seismologist would confirm 8 months later, was a previously unmapped minor fault running beneath the northeast corner of the leased acreage, close enough to the Lunsford fence line that micro-tremors along it registered as tactile vibration in solid ground and structure well before they ever generated enough seismic energy to trigger a station calibrated for events a mile or more away. Sound travels through air. Vibration travels through solid ground and bone both, often at frequencies and intensities too low for a standard seismometer's trigger threshold, but well within range of sustained human touch, especially touch trained over years to notice exactly that kind of difference. The fault had likely been moving in small, sub-threshold increments for years, the kind of slow, structured motion a person standing in continuous contact with the ground could, with enough patience and enough sensitivity, learn to distinguish from ordinary background noise, even if no instrument nearby was built to register it the same way. The injection well went into operation that June. The first measurable seismic event came in September, a magnitude 2. One that registered on the company's own array for the first time, followed by a 2. 8 in October, then a 3. 4 in early November. Hattie told her father through that whole stretch that the pulse coming up through the fence post had changed, grown sharper, less steady, the way a sound changes pitch right before something breaks. She started keeping her own informal record on a calendar in her room, a small mark for each evening the ground felt different than it had the evening before. Not because anybody had asked her to, but because writing it down felt like the only thing she could do with information nobody else seemed ready to use. On November 19, 2024, a magnitude 4. One event shook the county hard enough to crack foundations in 6 homes, including a long fissure through the Lunsford barn's concrete floor and a feed pad Boyd had poured himself only 4 years earlier. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission ordered the injection well shut in within 48 hours of that event, pending a full investigation. State seismologists confirmed within the month what an independent consultant Red Earth hired had already begun to suspect. Injection pressure from the well had reactivated the unmapped fault directly beneath the northeast section of the lease, the same ground where Hattie Lunsford had been feeling a changing pulse for the better part of a year before any company instrument ever caught up to her. Red Earth Energy's costs from that single well ran well past anything the project's original budget had accounted for. The well itself, an $18 million sunk investment, could never reopen at that location. Damage claims across the affected homes totaled 2. $4 million, including $340,000 toward repairing the Lunsford barn floor and feed pad. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission fined the company $2 million for inadequate seismic monitoring near a known population center, and the field's overall development plan had to be redesigned around a fault zone the company's own geologists hadn't known existed 8 months earlier, pushing total costs from that single oversight past $24 million. None of it, by most accounts inside the company, came as a complete surprise to everybody. A junior geologist on Callaway's own team, a woman 2 years out of graduate school named Priya Nair, had flagged the Lunsford report in an internal email back in April, recommending a closer look before the well went into operation, citing 2 academic papers on tactile seismic perception that she'd found after an evening of searching mostly out of her own curiosity. The email sat unanswered for 6 weeks before the project's timeline simply moved past it, the way busy timelines often do, with a junior employee's flagged concern that nobody senior had time to read closely. Marsh Callaway drove out to the Lunsford farm himself that December, with an interpreter this time, and sat at their kitchen table asking Hattie, through signed questions he'd clearly practiced beforehand, to describe exactly what she'd been feeling and when. He'd brought a notepad and filled 3 pages before he was finished, the same careful documentation habit he'd have used on any instrument reading, applied for the first time to a 16-year-old's hands. She told him, plain, that she hadn't known it was a fault, hadn't known the word for any of it at the time. She'd just known the ground felt wrong in a way it hadn't felt wrong before, and that the wrongness had been getting worse the longer the well ran. Callaway admitted, through the interpreter, that he honestly didn't know how to weigh that kind of evidence against an instrument reading, and that the company was only now starting to figure out how it should have. Hattie Lunsford is 17 this year. She still walks that fence line most evenings, still reads the ground the way her father taught her to, and has been invited twice since the shut-in to speak with university researchers studying tactile perception of low-frequency vibration in deaf individuals. A field of study, it turns out, with considerably more open questions than answers. She brought her calendar of marks to the first of those meetings, a little embarrassed by it at first, and watched a room full of scientists treat it as more useful data than anything that had come off Red Earth's own array in the months before the shut-in. Red Earth Energy quietly added a requirement to its seismic monitoring protocol the following spring, instructing field crews to take landowner-reported ground disturbances seriously regardless of source, a policy change company materials don't credit to anybody by name, though most people in that part of Grady County know exactly whose hand against a fence post made it necessary. Lonnie Stratton still watches Hattie from across the road some evenings, standing at that same fence post, hand flat against the wood. He says he used to think she was just listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. He's come to understand, in the time since, that she was listening to something the rest of them simply hadn't learned how to feel. He says it the same way every time he tells it, standing at his own fence now and then, looking across the road at a barn floor still showing the seam where the old crack got patched. That a company spent $18 million learning what a 16-year-old girl had already told them for free. And that the only real difference between her and their instruments was that she'd been listening the whole time, and they'd only just started.